Moving on to the next question, which is the 12-mark question. Discuss the likely impact on Rwandan consumers and clothing manufacturers of the increase in the tariff. So that looks like it's talking about extract 2 or B. So the increase in the tariff on imports of second-hand clothes. Use an appropriate diagram to support your answer. So of course that is going to be the tariff diagram itself. And that is a really good 12-mark question. And let's go and investigate that extract some more. So for those of you who don't understand what this means, so the extract, we read it before, what is essentially saying that Rwanda set set a tariff on the import of second-hand clothing. And why would they do that? Of course, let's think about the reason. What is the point of Rwanda setting a tariff on the import of second-hand clothing when it's a decently big industry for them? What is the reason for America setting all these tariffs? What is the Made in America thing? Why does Donald Trump do it? He does it to boost the American economy, to keep American employment high, to keep domestic employment high. And same thing with Rwanda. What they are trying to do, instead of them just importing clothing and importing second-hand clothing, they're trying to move away from that and trying to boost their own economy, boost their own clothing manufacturers. Instead of importing second-hand clothing, just make their own clothing and of course then export their own clothing, which of course is the main reason for this tariff. Now that is an example of applied knowledge. The extract doesn't tell me that. You don't specifically learn that. You need to use the examples you know, the content knowledge you know, and use that and apply that to different scenarios. But like I said, let's have a deeper dive into the extract to find a bits of application and a few paragraph points to speak about. Now having a look at the second paragraph, what does it say? It tells us the specific tariff that Rwandan government increased, so from the 20 cents to £2, $2.50. But a really small thing there, Rwanda's government increased the import tariffs, which therefore does mean they had a tariff on before. So that could work as a really good evaluation point later on. But continuing reading this paragraph, it then goes on to mention how the US basically are going to respond. And what do we call that? This is what I would call retaliation. So that could be another paragraph point if retaliation. And of course that could be another paragraph point if we're thinking about the impacts of setting this tariff. But of course, like I was saying before, what is the reason for this tariff? So it talks about some of the reasons why African manufacturing of clothing is weak. But again, what's the main reason? It says here, but second-hand clothing imports are a major factor, as because they're just importing so much second-hand clothing, there's no incentive for producers to produce their own clothes, basically. And again, going deeper into that, what is the incentive for the Tanzanian government? If they have a clothing industry, it means that that clothing industry will hire domestic workers, keeping domestic employment high. Thus, as we can see here, so it's estimated it accounted for half the fall in unemployment in African clothing. And it's just like I was saying before, Donald Trump increased the steel and aluminium tariffs from 25 to 50%. What is the reason? It's to protect that domestic steel industry, and more importantly, protect domestic employment. And that is the main reason for all these tariffs. And then if you look at the last paragraph, it talks about, of course, the retaliation perspective of things. So US said they're going to retaliate to Rwanda's tariff, but then it talks a really good evaluation point where it depends on the proportion which it actually affects Rwanda, since it says that Rwanda only sold 1.5 million worth of clothing to the US. Thus, the proportion that is going to affect Rwanda isn't very much, so it won't actually affect Rwanda much. So it won't be very impactful, essentially. So let's get started with the big diagram, the tariff diagram itself. And again, exam technique. A few months ago, well, depending on when this video is released, it might not be a few months ago, but there is a video on my channel which is specifically titled something around 12-mark question, Edexcel exam technique. In that video, there's a slight detail which talks about this specific question wording. So if your 12-mark question has the wording specifically, use an appropriate diagram to support your answer, or for example, if it's microeconomics, use a cost revenue diagram to support your answer. This means lots of the marks will be attributed to the diagram. Accurate use of the diagram, if it tells you to shift anything, shift in the diagram. Basically, diagrammatic analysis is going to pick you up loads of the marks. You do not actually need that much writing. Of course, back it up with as much theory as possible, but essentially your diagram should be driving your answer disproportionately, especially when it mentions use an appropriate diagram. But yeah, let's get started. So price, quantity on your axes, and just of course a simple tariff diagram with supply. But what is different in this diagram, of course, is supply but domestic. So what does it mean by domestic? It means producers within, so supply by producers within Rwanda, for example, in this example. And then we have demand And what is demand? Same thing with demand. It's demand, but it's demand domestic. So the demand for Rwandan consumers. And then how do we make this into a tariff diagram? We introduce the world supply. Now, what does this world supply represent, and how do we label this on the diagram? So this gives us two quantities. This gives us a Q1 now and a Q2. Now, what do these two quantities represent? And what is this firstly? This diagram firstly represents free trade. So before any trade barriers, this is how globalization or the global economy would look, as there's world supply and there's no tariffs on this diagram. Now, let's take a deeper dive into these respective quantities. Now, I always emphasize the thing that I see between all A-star students is what? Just diagrammatic analysis, but at a deeper level of understanding with diagrams. The reason why, what is the main tip with shade analysis? Be step by step. The only way you can be step by step with diagrams is if you fully understand the diagram. And let's go through this. So, with Q1, what does Q1 represent? Q1, of course, intersects the supply curve. And what is this actually representing? Q1 is representing the supply by domestic producers. So, at the price of WS, whatever price that may be, domestic producers are only supplying Q1. And now let's go on to the other side of the spectrum, which is Q2. Now, at the same price of WS, domestic consumers, so the Rwandan consumers, are demanding Q2. So now, what does this represent? Essentially, if you put it very simply, this represents excess demand, doesn't it? As Rwandan producers at the price of WS only want to supply Q1, but Rwandan consumers at the price of WS want Q2. So before globalization, this would literally be excess demand, a shortage in the market. But now after globalization, what has occurred? With globalization, of course, we've introduced international trade. Therefore, this discrepancy now is filled. And what is that filled by? This is filled by quantity imported. So Rwandan producers are not willing to supply at the price of WS. Well, they're not willing to match demand of domestic consumers at the price of WS. Therefore, due to globalization, of course, due to increased integration of the global economy, more trade between different economies, that demand is now met by foreign producers, and we import the difference in Q1 and Q2. Now, this isn't just for your understanding. You need to be able to recall this, and more importantly, you need to be able to apply this to questions and write this down in your chain of analysis. As many people, yes, they know the tariff diagram, basically, they know what quantity imported, what happens when you introduce a tariff, but they don't know the depths of it. Very simply, the examiner cannot credit you on things you do not show the examiner. So if you do not show the examiner you have this depth of understanding on the tariff diagram, he cannot give you the marks for it. So let's keep going. So this is initially, so of course, domestic Rwandan producers only want to supply Q1 at a low price. However, domestic Rwandan consumers want Q2 at this low price. Therefore, it leads to a massive amount of quantity imported. But now, let's keep going. What happens now? So, of course, Rwanda set a tariff. What is a tariff? A tariff is, of course, how do you define it? A tax on imports. A tax on imports, how is it going to affect the price of imports? Thus, it will increase the price of imports, thus shifting our world supply vertically upwards from world supply to now world supply plus tariff. Now, it actually gives us the specific amount of tariff that is set in the question. So I'm going to use that to pick up the application marks. So it goes to £2.50, well, $2.50. So I'm going to write $2.50 there. And now, of course, this should be fairly simple now. How does this affect, let's label up these new quantities, so Q3 and Q4. How does this now affect our quantity imported? So essentially, now at a higher price, what's happened? So now we have some new quantities, and why has this happened and what is happening? So of course, with the tariff being instated, it means the price of imports are now what? The price of imports are now higher. And this really goes back to foundations. So your foundational understanding of supply and demand. And I always talk about the inverse law of demand, which is, of course, when price increases, quantity demanded falls. Very early, it's like first two lessons in year 12, but foundations build up the more complex concepts. Now let's think about demand. So we have a contraction in demand here. So from Q2 to Q4, the demand has decreased. Why is that? Of course, like I said, inverse law of demand. When price increases, quantity demanded falls. And like I said, the price of imports has now increased. Thus, Rwandan consumers are now importing less, as why it's more expensive. So now what happens? So now that arrow, the quantity imported, where previously it was from Q1 to Q2, now it has decreased to now Q3 to Q4. And very simply, what does the tariff do? It changes the quantity imported from Q1, Q2 to now a reduction to Q3, Q4. Now let's go a step deeper. What is actually happening behind the scenes now? So have Rwandan consumers just completely stopped wearing clothes? Have they stopped their need for clothing? Probably not, and the answer is of course no. So what is actually happening now, since they're no longer getting the same amount imported, so where are they getting their clothing now? And this is where you switch it up and you start thinking about the domestic suppliers and the domestic consumers. So now, if the quantity imported is decreasing from Q1, Q2 to now Q3, Q4, what does this mean? This means domestic consumers, since the price of imports are more expensive, they have substituted. Rwandan consumers have substituted from buying expensive imports to relatively cheaper domestic goods. So essentially, all that quantity we lost of importing, so like Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4, is just switched to, instead of buying imports, they have now substituted to buying domestic goods. This again now links back to the overarching theme of why governments instate tariffs, which were again Steel America 2025, the 50% tariff on steel and aluminium. Why do they do it? Since if now consumers, domestic consumers, substitute away from buying foreign imports, which support foreign countries, circular flow, you're literally pumping money into a foreign country, they substitute away from doing that now to now essentially pumping money into their own economy. And if you're buying from domestic producers, why is that so positive? You buy from domestic producers, they are keeping, who do domestic producers hire? They hire domestic workers. Therefore, by purchasing domestic goods, you're keeping domestic employment high. Why is that? Why do we hire workers? We hire workers to produce goods. If we're not producing any goods, we don't need any workers. What is that the concept of? That is a concept of derived demand. Therefore, if you're producing lots of goods domestically, this means there's a high derived demand for domestic labour. And there's high derived demand for domestic labour, of course, domestic employment stays high. Thus, this is the whole concept of protectionism, the whole concept of made in America, whatever they call it, where America wants to keep the production within America, and they want to keep demand within American firms. Thus meaning, since American firms hire American workers, thus keeping American employment high. And same thing for Rwanda. If Rwandan producers are doing well, they're producing lots of goods, it means that Rwandan employment, the derived demand for Rwandan labour will remain high. Make sure, of course, you always include application like it mentions here. Where was it? Talking about here. So the factory in, I can't remember how to say this, Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, where it's only operating at 40% of its capacity and employs 600 workers. You could talk about how now, since the tariff has been set, individuals will stop importing second-hand goods. They will start producing the goods themselves. Thus, of course, meaning that they could increase the number of workers from 600 to whatever they need. And I've tried to write as much as that up as possible, as briefly as possible. So tariff, tax and imports. What does that do? Increase the price of imported goods due to the inverse law of demand. This causes quantity imported to fall from Q1, Q2 to Q3, Q4. As Y, substitute individuals, domestic consumers substitute from buying imported goods from foreign producers to now buying from domestic producers, thus increasing derived demand for domestic employment, of course keeping domestic employment high, having massive positive effects on the domestic economy, which is of course the entire concept, the entire topic of protectionism. But now, of course, like I said before, with these 12-mark questions, when they specifically tell you about a diagram, you need a lot of diagrammatic analysis, very deep understanding on these diagrams. And with the tariff diagram, we could actually add a bit more here and could 100% get away with one paragraph here, really in depth, really explaining the diagram. No need for a second paragraph, of course. Make sure you include your evaluation though. So now, what else can we add to this diagram? And I'm going to label up these different parts. So we have A, B, we'll label that D, and C. Now, what do these parts, so the letters respectively, A, B, C, and D, represent? Little content knowledge test. Let's start with A. A is, of course, the increase in producer surplus, and we talk about domestic producers here. Why is there an increase in domestic producer surplus? Since of course with the tariff, the price increases from WS to a new higher price, and if producers are selling for higher price, it means there's more producers who are selling for more than they are willing to sell for, thus be aligning with the definition of producer surplus. Then what is B and D? B and D, of course, being the welfare loss. You talk about consumer welfare loss. There's not much at A level you need to know about it. Just label it welfare loss. Of course, if you think about consumers are now having to pay a higher price due to the tariff. Thus, you could mention that. And the main one, C, what does C represent? These are the main ones students, consumers, so students get confused. The main aim of the tariff for governments is usually never to just solely bring in tax revenue. There's much more effective ways to bring tax revenue. Yes, it is a byproduct and it is definitely a positive of tariffs compared to something like a subsidy, since subsidy uses tax revenue, whereas, and of course that is an example of another protectionist policy, a subsidy uses tax revenue, whereas a tariff brings in tax revenue. But the main reason that these tariffs are used is, the main overarching reason is to protect domestic employment and protect domestic producers. Whereas in the textbooks, when you're just learning economics theory, this is why real world application is absolutely vital to understand the relative weightings of things. Yes, of course, it brings in tax revenue, and in the grand scheme of things, the tax revenue is fairly insignificant. But yeah, and then of course, including this into chain of analysis, maybe you could mention it at the end. If you really wanted to, you could do a separate paragraph, just maybe going a bit more in depth with these specific points. But yeah, that is how I would end that paragraph for this 12-mark question. Like I said, diagrammatic analysis, deep understanding of the diagram is absolutely essential, as you can probably understand after this chain of analysis. But now let's move on to a bit of evaluation for this 12-mark question. And of course, first one that comes to mind is one we mentioned earlier, which was this last bit. So the word is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of retaliation from the US, or the degree of retaliation from competing countries. As for example, if the US retaliate, this could negate the positive effects of protecting domestic producers or protecting domestic employment. As for example, I would include the bit of application, Rwanda export 1.5 million worth of clothing to the US. Thus, if the US set a big tariff in retaliation to these Rwandan tariffs, it could, like I said, therefore negate the positive effects of the tariff. Thus, you wouldn't mention government failure because it's macro, but it's quite a decent example of government failure. And again, with second evaluation point, just again looking at the extract, this line also is quite interesting. When a used imported t-shirt sells for the price of a bottle of water, essentially saying that it's almost impossible to compete with these imported t-shirts, as they are imported clothing, as they are so cheap. So a really good evaluation point is saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on even after the tariff, whether domestic producers would still be able to compete, as used clothing is so cheap. It's so much cheaper than producing, because as the extract again mentions, it talks about the reasons why Africa's production has decreased. I think it talked about things like privatization. Can't seem to find it. Yeah, things like ineffective privatization, collapsing infrastructure. So of course that would take millions in investment to get them back up to speed, to get them efficient, to get them productive. Therefore, in the short term at least, it still may be more effective for these traders to import clothing rather than producers start producing clothing themselves, thus negating the positive effects, like we said, on it's not going to increase domestic employment. Domestic producers will not be producing more, at least in the short run. So that's another slightly niche evaluation point. But there's not many evaluation points here, since of course it's a classic one for tariffs is the size of the tariff. It's totally the size of the tariffs. And of course you could talk about elasticity. With of course clothing, you could say it is a necessity. Thus it's going to have a degree of inelastic demand. Thus, even though there's an increase in the price, so the tariff might not actually decrease quantity demanded that much, as due to clothing being a necessity, it's just going to increase tax revenue and increase prices, so just massively decrease consumer surplus and massively decrease consumer outcomes, rather than actually have the intended effect of trying to reduce quantity imported. Essentially, just how we'd put it, if for example you talk about a tax on sugary drinks. So essentially a tax on sugary drinks, what is the point? To help basically health outcomes, stop people consuming sugar. But what actually happens due to the inelasticity of sugary drinks, as they have addictive features, what actually happens when you introduce a sugar tax? Instead of actually reducing the consumption of sugary drinks, what it does, it just massively increases tax revenue and reduces consumer surplus. Why? Since it just increases the price, and the marginal difference in a decrease of quantity demanded is not that much. And of course, again, that is an example of government failure, since what is the main reason why the government implement this policy is not to increase tax revenue, is to try improve health outcomes, improve consumer outcomes, which of course, as a policy has not done that, is an example of government failure. But that is of course a bit of a side point. But yeah, that is how I would answer this 12-mark question. Of course, decent sized paragraph, 2 to 3 evaluation points, and that should be more than enough.